Good morning. I'm told to call you to order. I am just obeying Liz. Shh. If we can all come in and grab seats, we'll get started. I'm honored to facilitate this session on taking gender-based violence prevention to scale. I suspect, do I see Liz? Where is she? I suspect that Liz asked me to do this because she knows that over the years of my participation in SVRI, she can count on me at some point to say, how are we taking our experiments, our evidence to scale? I know that all of us share that question, and I know that it's more than just a technical one, and we know as well that it's not an easy one. And I know from yesterday and from knowing many of you in the room that it is both a moral and a personal imperative for all of us. I'm in this field because 4 decades ago, in my all-male dormitory at university, a group of young men took a young woman back to their room on a Friday night and sexually assaulted her. I don't say that lightly. I know that many of you as survivors and who work with survivors in the room know what that means. I stepped into this work with an uncertainty of how could I be a male ally? Where should I act? Where should I step in? And a sense of shame that it took me a while to find my voice in this space, to say how can men step up and be allies in the cause? I was thinking about that recently, and I know many of you have as well, in the horrific case in France of Gisèle Pelicot. As many of us have watched that case unfold, it's clear how many decades, how many men are involved, and how many men were silent around that. A journalist asked one of the men in the town what he thought about it, how he felt about it as a man, and he said, "I feel ashamed to be a man." I don't think that it helps us very much for men to feel ashamed of being men, to be in this space, but I do think for all of us, we have to think about the cause and perhaps about being ashamed of not acting big enough and urgently enough and at scale. SVRI, you are here because SVRI has existed for 21 years as the biggest global platform acting to bring us together with evidence-based work around gender-based violence. It is a call for all of us to work at scale. And I think as we look at those 21 years, if we look at the advocates, the women leaders who have built this field over decades, I think it's okay to say the time is now to act on this field, to act on what we know. If you're here at the SVRI Forum, let it be known that you signed on to an ambitious mission statement. If I may read it. Liz, may I read it? Is ending gender-based violence against women and children in our lifetime. That is a mission at scale. If you're here, you believe in that, you've signed on to it. I represent an organization. I'm not sure if I introduced myself. I'm Gary Barker. I'm the CEO and founder of Equimundo. We as an organization work to call men out for harm and inaction and call all men in to action for gender equality and ending violence. And we believe firmly that the shame can never be on survivors. The shame has to be on us for not acting in a big enough and scaled up enough way. Thank you. So let's take a deep breath as we step into this day. We know the topics we talk about are intense, they're personal, they are emotional for many of us. So let us step in, just say, sort of take a deep breath, and that's to me as well. I feel like if I go on longer, I'm risking some mansplaining here. And you didn't pay your registration fees for that. So let's step into this panel. We have 4 examples of how to go to scale. We've got a conversation about policies and how they can work and what needs to happen there. We have a conversation about gender transformative parenting and how to take that to scale with the health sector. We have a presentation on how to work with income generation and food security and build gender-based violence into that and take it to scale. And we have an example from working with the education sector and how to take that to scale. So very excited to hear from our 4 groupings, not 4 panelists. We've got 6 panelists. So let me stop and hand over to the first one. We will hear first from Rachel Pierotti, who is a senior social scientist in the Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank. Rachel, over to you.
All right, thank you, Gary, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. Can you see my presentation? Not yet, right? We have it here? There it is, got it. Thank you. Again, my name is Rachel Pierotti. I'm presenting work that is joint with Lori Heisey of the Prevention Collaborative. This is both a literature review and what we would like to propose as a research agenda on policy levers for reducing intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And I will talk more about what I mean by that, but first, a bit of motivation. I think it fits well in the discussion today, which is about impact at scale. Policies, regulations, laws, by their very nature, have the potential for population-wide impact. And that is one of the main motivations for looking at policies and whether they're effective for reducing rates of violence. A second motivation is that policy making is squarely within the authority and sort of the wheelhouse of government policymakers. And for those policymakers who are keen to do something to reduce rates of violence, they're often looking for evidence about what types of policies or regulations they can implement to make a difference. But the evidence base here is not the same as the evidence base that we have, thanks to many of you in this room, about the effectiveness of community-based or group-based interventions for reducing violence. So having a body of evidence on policies and regulations and which of those are effective for reducing violence is really potentially a tool for communicating with policymakers about something that is within their core competencies. And then one last piece of motivation is that when Lori and I started this work, we weren't sure that we would find much existing evidence. I'm happy to report that there are some studies that examine the causal impact of policy reform on rates of violence. But I think part of the reason that the existing evidence hasn't been used so much in policy dialogue is because it hasn't been pulled together into sort of one agenda. And that's part of our motivation for doing this review. Now I've gone twice. So quick note on methodology. This is ongoing work, and we are attempting to be comprehensive rather than systematic, which basically means that we've searched everywhere we could think to search for studies that would meet our inclusion criteria for this review. One of the key elements of those inclusion criteria is that the study has to evaluate the causal impact of a policy or regulatory reform on rates of violence. And then, of course, we're also making use of other relevant evidence. So policy, I keep talking about policies, policy levers. What do I mean? There are many different types and domains of policy that could potentially have an impact on rates of violence in the population. This includes things like education policy, alcohol regulation, social protection systems, infrastructure investments, justice sector reforms, health services, family law, labor market policies, and women's leadership and activism. So this is a really broad scope. It's many policy domains. And to start with then, to make sense of all of these different types of policies and how they might relate to rates of violence, we needed some sort of conceptual framework. So we started at the most basic. What are the proximate determinants of rates of violence in a population? And those were 3. women's exposure to violence, men's propensity to abuse, and relationship dynamics. So then, of course, the question is, how do you get from policies, laws, regulations to these three outcomes that we really care about? And that's through a series of different intermediary pathways. Rather than walking you through all of these in the abstract, though, I wanted to give an example, or two examples of policy domains. The first is education policy. So governments have control or regulate many aspects of an education system. Everything from how many years of education are compulsory or required, what kinds of training teachers are meant to have, how many schools are available, what's included in the curriculum. All of these elements are within government policy-making scope. And so thinking first about the types of education policies that increase access and therefore increase the number of years of education that girls are likely to get. That kind of policy change can have an impact on rates of violence through a couple different mechanisms. The first is a change in partnership formation. We know from other research that more highly educated girls tend to marry more highly educated boys. And those partnerships are less likely to be violent ones, on average. So this is one way in which an education policy that expands access can reduce women's exposure to violence and reduce rates of violence. A second potential pathway from a policy that increases women's educational attainment to lower rates of violence is through increasing women's relative power in their relationships. Perhaps because their economic opportunities are better, their earnings opportunities are better. And that can both reduce women's exposure to violence and men's propensity to abuse. Thinking about a different type of education policy, thinking more on the curriculum side, including certain elements in education curricula can, so for example, things like life skills education or comprehensive sexuality education, those types of curriculum components can change attitudes and norms about gender and violence and perhaps improve socio-emotional skills. Both of those types of changes can lead to reductions in rates of violence by reducing men's propensity to abuse or improving relationship dynamics. But all of this is theoretical, it's hypothetical. So what do we actually see in the studies that are available? Sorry, I can't get the clicker to work, so I keep going back and forth. We found 9 studies that examine the causal impact of education policies on rates of violence. These 9 studies look at 3 types of policy changes. The first is expansion of public primary school. Second is an increase in the number of years of compulsory schooling. And third are stipends to retain girls in secondary school. Of course, there are many areas of education policy that could hypothetically have an impact on rates of violence, but those have not yet been examined in the literature. So what do we see? 9 studies is not a sufficient evidence base to make definitive conclusions, but there are some trends, some patterns across these studies that at the very minimum suggest that education policy may be an avenue for reducing rates of violence in the population. Primary school expansion seems not to be the answer. There does not seem to be any impact on rates of violence due to the expansion of primary school. On the other hand, expanding access to secondary schooling, either by increasing the number of years of compulsory education or by offering stipends to support girls' retention in secondary school, in both of those policy changes, we see reductions in rates of intimate partner violence. One last comment on education policy before moving on is on the mechanisms. Across these 9 studies, there is most consistent support for the idea that it is a change in partnerships that is leading to reductions in rates of violence. Again, that these more highly educated girls, the policy change led them to have access to more education. They then partnered with boys with higher education. And that is what drove the reduction in rates of violence. There's also support in some contexts for improvements in women's economic opportunities as an important mechanism. There's no evidence in these 9 studies that education is having an impact on rates of violence because of attitudinal or normative change. I will say, however, though, that these studies don't look at changes in curriculum or changes in teacher training. And perhaps it's those types of policies that would be most likely to have an impact through attitudinal or normative change. So more research to be done. All right, a second example is family law, or more specifically, divorce law. Many countries in recent decades have instituted legal changes to make divorce more accessible to everyone, and that includes women in abusive relationships. And there are 2 primary pathways through which changes in divorce law, or making divorce more accessible, could lead to lower rates of violence in the population. The first is, if divorce is accessible, then women may be able to more credibly threaten to leave their relationships. And with that credible threat, they can demand better treatment in those relationships. The other pathway is that women can exit their violent relationships. So what do we see in the literature? So far, we have identified 7 studies that estimate the causal impact of divorce law reform on rates of violence. These look at 3 different types of changes. The first is the introduction of unilateral, no-fault divorce. That means that either partner can request a divorce, and they do not have to prove that their partner did something wrong in order to justify that divorce. The second type of change is the inclusion of intimate partner violence as a legitimate reason for requesting a fault-based divorce. And the third change is a change in custody laws, child custody laws, that mean the abusive partner is not given an equal say in custody decisions. Again, as with education policy, there are other types of legal changes within this policy domain that could conceivably have an impact on rates of violence, but that have not yet been explored. So what do we see in the studies? Again, 7 studies. It's not sufficient to draw conclusions, especially when we're talking about studies across the globe. And yet, there are some consistent findings that again suggest that changes in divorce laws, at least in some contexts and for some populations, can lead to lower rates of intimate partner violence. Same with the change in child custody regulations. And again, I want to comment on the mechanisms across these studies. It seems that most of the reason that we see a reduction in violence coming from changes in divorce law comes from reductions in violence within existing relationships and not from increases in divorce. So I mentioned at the beginning that we needed a conceptual framework to help us think through all of these different policy domains and how those changes in policy might lead to reductions in rates of intimate partner violence or sexual assault. This is the complete conceptual framework, but I'm not going to stay here long enough to talk through it in detail. Instead, I would like to close with a suggestion of a research agenda, especially if I can manage to move forward. There we are. So Why? Why spend the time to examine whether changes in policy can lead to reductions in violence? Two primary motivations. The first is that policy reforms can have population-level impacts. So we are talking about impact at scale. The second is that policy reforms are within the mandate of government policymakers, and having an evidence base that we can use as a tool for advocacy and that policymakers can use when they're looking to make changes for their population would be a really useful tool. And then the how, I'm going to say mostly stay tuned. The report with this evidence review should be available next year. But what we've found so far is, first, that this type of research that examines the impact of policies on rates of violence is possible. And second, that there are a lot of evidence gaps and more research is needed, and I hope we can all contribute to that agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. From the policy levers and what we need to know about that, we're going to step into 3 more programmatic interventions that are working to go to scale. We'll start off with an intervention from Rwanda, so I'm pleased to introduce Kate Doyle, who is a senior fellow with Equimundo and also with the Prevention Collaborative, and also Fidel Rutayasidi, who is the CEO and founder of the Rwandan Men's Resource Center based in Kigali. Kate and Fidel, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. We're really excited to be here. At the last SVRI, we had the opportunity to share with you some of our exciting 6-year findings of impact. And today we're going to share with you a bit of our journey to scaling the Bandabareho program in Rwanda. And we want to highlight some of the factors that we think have enabled us to have success, because we know that many of you might be on your own journey to scale, and we think these might be helpful, particularly those who might be working with government.
So, for those who are not familiar with Bandabareho, what is it? So Bandabareho means actually a role model in Kinyarwanda, and it is a gender transformative intervention for fathers and couples with young children under 5. It leverages fatherhood as an entry point. As you all know, fatherhood is a period where men are open for change. So Bandabareho uses fatherhood as an entry point to engage men together with their partners in 17 interactive sessions that address key areas like prevention of violence against children, violence against women, but also it improves health outcomes for mothers and children, and it encourages fathers to take or to be involved in caregiving roles. And finally, Bandabareho promotes healthier couple relationships. So, Bandabareho has been effective in reducing violence over the long term, especially violence in intimate partner violence, but also violence against children. So, Bandabareho has been effective even after 6 years. So the randomized control trial, which was conducted after 6 years, has revealed lasting changes over many other outcomes, including maternal health seeking, but also men's accompaniment, couples communication, and many other areas like reduction of depression among fathers.
Okay, so now we're going to move into how are we scaling this up with government. And so we are particularly working together with government, with the Ministry of Health and the Rwanda Biomedical Center to institutionalize or embed the Bandabareho program in the health system. So we're working together to train community health workers to deliver the program as part of their routine work. And this pathway to scale was chosen by a multi-sectoral government advisory group together with RAMREC and Equimundo as one of the most stable, feasible, and sustainable ways that we could actually scale this impact to more communities, because the health system is decentralized from national level all the way down to village level through the community health workforce. And in the last 4 years, we've been able to reach nearly 40,000 parents with Bande Barejo program when delivered by community health workers. But we want to emphasize that this has been a long-term, 10-year journey to get to this point. It does not happen overnight. So we started with a pilot back in 2013 where we contextually adapted the program, we tested it, we evaluated it through a randomized controlled trial. And then you'll see there's a period of time between our pilot and then when the opportunity we start to transition the program to scale. So it took a number of years to actually get the evidence, to disseminate the evidence, to get policymakers at the highest levels on board with the idea of scaling. Yet, from the very beginning, we heard from women, from men, from families that they wanted this program to be available to more people in their communities. So we worked together with the Rwanda Biomedical Center to look at opportunities for scale. And then in 2019, we were able to then adapt the program so that it could be delivered by community health workers and test the effectiveness and the feasibility and the quality and fidelity of the program when delivered at scale within one district. And based on that experience, we're now into the next phase of scaling up beyond. So we're scaling up across 3 districts. And now that we know community health workers can deliver the program, we're really focusing on how do we build the infrastructure around the community health workers so that the health system can fully lead in the training, the implementation, the monitoring, the supervision, and the reporting of the program at all levels. And our aim is really to use the evidence and the learning that we're generating in this phase to inform a national scale-up strategy so that this program could be available to parents across Rwanda through the health system.
So now, what are the contributing factors behind our success? Number 1, Bande Barejo is aligned to the existing national policies. As you all know, Rwanda has a very supportive gender policy environment, but also a high-level political will in terms of supporting gender equality, violence prevention, and men's engagement. As you all know, Rwanda is a gender champion. Rwanda has now 62% of women in parliament. Rwanda has recently approved a national male engagement strategy, and all this actually gives Bande Barejo a chance to be owned by the government, but also to be supported by the government. And secondly, Bande Barejo aligns well and fits well with this national policy, and that's why the government really owns it and buys it. And another contributing factor is the evidence. The evidence, the randomized controlled trial, has convinced the government to really support this program and to own it. The other contributing factor is a close collaboration with the government. So Bande Barejo has maintained a close collaboration with the government from the beginnings, since the pilot phase adaptation, but also during the implementation as well as during the research phases. So the collaboration also has been flexible from both parties in terms of respecting each party's schedule or priorities or plans. And, but also another key important contributing factor is the establishment of a multi-sectoral advisory committee, which is composed of the Ministry of Health, the Rwanda Biomedical Center, the Ministry of Gender, the National Children's Development Center, which have been part and parcel of the process since the beginning, and they provide orientation, advisory committee, and this helps us to also be supported. And all these institutions are supporting the program by making sure that everyone really owns the program. Apart from these successes, we also have encountered some challenges. One of the challenges is the turnover of staff from the government. As you all know, government staff are not stable. A mayor can be changed anytime, a minister can be changed anytime. So when we have new minister, we have to make sure that we explain to him or her, and the engagement of high leaders is a problem.
Okay. And one of the other factors of success is that we have this well-chosen pathway to scale. So as I said, the community health system goes from the national level all the way down to the village level with clear mechanisms of reporting and supervision. And we've seen that community health workers are well placed to deliver Bande Borejo. They're trusted by community members, and we've seen that it is possible for them to deliver the program with quality and fidelity, but when they're given the right training and support. And this is an area where we've been doing a lot of learning around how do we tailor the training of community health workers so that they are fully equipped to be able to implement this gender transformative approach, which is quite different than many of the other interventions that they're responsible for in their communities. And we also see that they report benefits for themselves, benefits for their work, greater trust with communities, being seen as an important resource by communities, and they see benefits for the communities themselves. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we're now really focusing on learning about how to equip the health system around them to fully support them, to provide supportive supervision, to ensure observation of sessions, to be able to report from the village level all the way up to the national level of what is happening in the program. And we know that this takes time. So it is a process in which we are investing a lot of time and evidence. And one of the things that we have chosen to do very intentionally is adopt a slow and steady approach. There is often a push for scaling quickly, for scaling at lower cost, for cutting corners, and we've really had a lot of intentional discussions with government around the need to do this in a slow and steady way, so a gradual, iterative process where we're able to adapt and test the program for scaling rather than just very quickly rushing to roll it out to more communities, because our focus is really on scaling the impact, making sure the families who participate in the program benefit from it, not just to reach more numbers. And we're also investing in continuous research to ensure that the program is continuing to be implemented with quality and fidelity and impact, and ensuring that between each stage we allow sufficient time where we can actually integrate what we're learning and make improvements before it's too late. And this has really required a lot of close collaboration between the program creators, the implementers, the researchers, the government, and it's a mutual learning process. We're learning about scale, the government is learning about gender transformative approaches, we're learning about the health system, so there's a lot of mutual learning that is happening, and a lot of that is learning by doing rather than research. And yet, all of this is challenging to manage with government and donor expectations of scaling quickly, of being able to hand over a program to a government after 1 year and expect that they're fully capable of being able to roll it out. And so we've had to manage those expectations and have a lot of intentional conversations with both government and donors about how to do this well. And one of the things that's made that possible is by using layered and flexible funding. It is not easy to fund programming at scale, particularly, as we mentioned, having this slow and steady approach. So we've had to be quite creative, but selective, in how we fundraise for the scale-up to enable this stage-by-stage evolution, where we're testing in one district, we're learning, we're adapting, we're making changes before we move to the next district. And so this has required us to pool or layer funding from multiple donors together. And sometimes this means using funding that's for violence prevention alongside funding that's for gender equality or funding that's for unpaid care work, but making sure that all of that funding is feeding into our mutual aims of scaling up this program without having to change the program or add new components. And what's made a lot of that possible is that we have had flexible funding over the years from particular foundations that have allowed us to fill key gaps. When there was no money for implementation, this allowed us to retain the staff who have the historical knowledge and experience with this program, to be able to transition between phases, and to be able to do key pieces of research that help us to understand what's working and what's not, and to generate the evidence needed to convince government. And yet that is in itself a very big challenge. It's hard to manage all of these different funding and reporting requirements and ensuring that they support our vision of scale. And so in closing, we just want to say that scaling is a process which takes time, and we hope that perhaps our insights and our experience might be helpful to others who are on that journey to scale or donors who are thinking about funding at scale.
So I would like to thank all our donors for funding this scale-up, but also the government of Rwanda, which is very supportive, And thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kate and Fidel, for that presentation of a 10-year journey. We'll switch now from a gender transformative parenting program being implemented in the health sector to talk about a women's economic empowerment plus a food security program that also has an impressive length of data. Want to hear about that. We know that women's economic empowerment is one of the mechanisms or the prevention approaches that's got a lot of data and a lot of promise of success. So I'm happy to introduce Shalini Roy, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI. Shalini, over to you.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to be with you all. This work, the evolution of intimate partner violence impacts from cash transfers, food transfers, and behavior change communication, is based on mixed method experimental evidence from a 9-year post-program follow-up in Bangladesh, so a very long study. This presentation is on behalf of a large team, several of whom are in the audience. Very unfortunately, our colleague and planned co-presenter Nasrin Sultana couldn't be with us due to passport issues, so it will be just me this morning. So we start with the observation that while violence against women has many risk factors, and unfortunately violence does cut across socioeconomic classes, poverty is a major risk factor. This has led the World Health Organization to include poverty reduced among the 7 strategies in its Preventing Violence Against Women framework for global policymakers. Notably, within this strategy, there is currently only one type of intervention that the WHO characterizes as promising in low and middle income countries, based on it being supported by sufficient rigorous evidence, specifically for reducing intimate partner violence. And that is economic transfers, which includes cash transfers, vouchers, and in-kind transfers like food. So this session is on scaling up. So we note here that there are kind of 2 complementary approaches you can think of to scaling prevention of violence against women, speaking to the presentations we just heard. And both of these are really needed. One approach can be considered bottom-up, where programming is developed explicitly to address IPV in a particular setting, and if it's successful at small scale, then we try to scale it up or replicate it in other contexts. This is relevant to the very interesting case study in Rwanda we just heard. The other approach can be considered more top-down, where we find a sector that corresponds to a key driver of IPV. We identify existing effective large-scale programming in that sector, and we try within that sector's constraints to influence and optimize it for prevention. So economic transfers need this top-down lens. They are already being funded and implemented at very large scale by the social protection sector. What we want to do is make them better within that sector's constraints. So the question is, how can we design these economic transfer programs for greater effectiveness and sustainability of IPV prevention? So to give just a flavor of how economic transfers fit this frame of being already at scale and effective, but still needing to be optimized, we give the example of cash transfers, which are the most common type of economic transfers in low and middle income countries. So cash transfer programs are already at large scale. They reach many at-risk households. These programs tend to be targeted to poor households. Their coverage is rapidly growing in low and middle income countries, even more so because they're increasingly being used to respond to crises. Cash transfer programs have robust evidence showing rigorously that they can reduce IPV, and that's even without explicit violence prevention objectives or programming. A recent meta-analysis, a recent mixed method review, both show these programs largely decrease IPV, but there's much less known on whether these impacts are sustained after the programs end. And we really want to be able to understand and design for this. So the study we do here focuses on trying to unpack the sustainability of the type of economic transfer programs that can be at scale. The intervention that we study has many key features of at-scale programs of economic transfers. For example, it provides regular cash or food transfers over multiple years to women in poor rural households, which is a common model. It includes a group-based activity linked to transfers. This is also common. And it covers different contexts within a country, which is of course going to be the case in large-scale programs. But because our intervention is actually a pilot designed as a randomized controlled trial, we are able to evaluate and try to unpack what factors contribute to sustainability. And specifically, we conduct a mixed method study over 11 years, 2 years of intervention, 9 years post-intervention, to address several questions that we hope inform future program design. So first, how do effects on IPV evolve after the transfers end, and through what pathways? Second, how does the role of these plus components, which is the activities linked to transfers, evolve over time? And third, how does context shape all of this? So moving to the intervention we look at, it's called the Transfer Modality Research Initiative, or TMRI, in Bangladesh. It was implemented by the World Food Program and IFPRI Bangladesh. And it was 2 randomized control trials over 2 years in 2 regions of Bangladesh that are shown in the map, which we refer to as the North and the Coastal South. The aim of this program was not explicitly to reduce violence against women. Like many other social protection programs, it was to improve household food security and secondarily child nutrition. So the recipients of this program were mothers of young children in poor rural households. And with the RCT design, we varied whether mothers received monthly cash or food transfers, and whether these transfers were provided on their own or with a plus, which was a group-based nutrition behavior change communication, which is a mouthful, or BCC, which I'll describe more in a moment. Of note, the intervention arms we tested differed somewhat in the North versus the South. Both regions had a no intervention control group, a cash-only group, a food-only group, but only the North had cash plus BCC, only the South had food plus BCC. So what was the BCC? It had 3 components, but the most intensive was a weekly group meeting for participant women. So that's every week for 2 years. These were again not focused on gender or violence, rather they were about nutrition, but they were very interactive and in a context where female seclusion prevailed and where poor women particularly faced quite a bit of stigma in their community and limited social interaction. These were a rare opportunity for participant women to meet regularly with other women and also to become experts on a topic, nutrition, that was valued by their community. So some sessions of the BCC also invited other household members who were influential decision makers, like husbands and mothers-in-law, and other BCC components included twice-a-month home visits, monthly meetings that also engaged the community. So just to give a sense of the timeline, the program itself was from May 2012 to April 2014, 2 years, but all our data collection on IPV was actually after the program. And this is frankly because the original donors were not focused on violence, but thankfully the donors for these later rounds who are in the audience, thankfully were. So the quantitative data post-program were collected across several rounds through 8 years post-program. These were used to estimate TMRI's impacts on post-program emotional intimate partner violence and physical intimate partner violence, as well as some indicators for possible pathways. The qualitative data collection occurred all at 9 years post-program, but reflected back on the full 11 years, so the 2 years of the program and 9 years post-program, including both men and women, and really focused on exploring the pathways through which IPV impacts evolved over time and how context influenced these. So, given time, we'll be very brief on the findings. You won't see numbers. I unfortunately won't be able to read aloud all the qualitative quotes that are on the slides, but let's jump in. So first, on IPV impacts during the program, here we have qualitative data to draw on, and it reflects that across both the regions, across all the arms, food or cash, with or without the plus, relationships with husbands mostly improved, or some did not change. There's a quote from a woman receiving food plus BCC in the South who described improvement. He really liked the fact that I was getting food from the project, so he used to behave pretty well with me. We didn't have a lot of fights anymore. Others said things were always good and this didn't change during TMRI, or that things were always bad and this didn't change during TMRI. Notably, we did not see anyone report that TMRI caused increases in IPV. We did not see that. Now what happened to TMRI's IPV impacts after the program ended? Here we rely mostly on the quantitative work, because in the qualitative, some do report relationships changed over the 9 years after the program, but it was very hard for them to attribute whether these changes in their relationships were because of receiving this program so many years ago, or other things that had happened in their lives, including the couple simply getting older. So in the quantitative work, because of the randomized controlled trial design, we are able to attribute what differences appear to be due to the program itself. And what we see is, frankly, a very complex picture that varies over time, but also by treatment arm and context. In both regions, we see that food alone caused no sustained reductions in IPV. It had reduced IPV during the program, but after we don't see any changes anymore. Cash, even without the plus component, eventually did lead to reduced post-program IPV in one region, the north, but never in the other, the south. The cash with the plus component in the north consistently reduced IPV in every post-program round we looked at through 8 years post-program, so that's 8 years after the transfers in BCC had ended. Food plus BCC in the south sustained IPV reductions only very soon after the program ended. That's 6 months after the program had stopped. But after that, we no longer saw any impacts. So this is a complex picture. Why is that? So we'll try to give an overview of the pathways first, and then some examples of qualitative quotes to illustrate each. So during the program, we see 4 pathways emerge based on the qualitative work. The first is economic security and emotional well-being. This is the idea that the program improves economic security, and this reduces poverty-related stress at the household level and improves emotional well-being for everyone in the household. This happened for many in this study during the program. The second is family dynamics, which in this context we see really importantly includes in-laws. This is the idea that the program reduces conflict within the household, and we see this happen for some during the program. The third is women's empowerment. This is the idea that the program might improve women's standing in the household and increase their power in the relationship. Again, this happened for some during the program. And the fourth is social and community support. This is the idea that the program might reduce women's isolation, increase their visibility, their support in the community. This really happened during the program, particularly for the women who were attending the group-based BCC. Now, let's think about what happened after the program ended. Our quantitative and qualitative work together suggests that the strongest pathway for any sustained post-program reductions that we see in IPV is this first pathway, sustained improvements in economic security and emotional well-being. Essentially, we see that the patterns of sustained economic security track the patterns of sustained reductions in IPV, so they're the strongest for the cash plus BCC in the north. They hold to some extent for cash only in the north. They're very limited for the food and for all the arms in the south. The family dynamics and women's empowerment pathways, although they operated for some during the program, do not appear to be sustained after the program. And the social and community support, which was strongest among BCC participants during the program, continues to be sustained soon after the program ends, but does seem to fade out as time passes. So for a snapshot of qualitative insights on each pathway, first we look at the economic security. Again, this was the strongest pathway for sustained reductions in IPV where they occurred. During the program, we see that the receipt of transfers themselves led to this effect. There's a quote from a man in the South whose household receives food plus BCC, and he says, "We could eat 3 times a day. There were positive changes in our lives. We were at peace." After the program, it really depends on whether households were able to sustain these post-program economic security improvements once the transfers had stopped. And this seems much more challenging in the southern region than the north. In the south, which is disaster-prone, harder for livelihoods, a man whose household had received food says, "We were suffering from poverty again. My income was the same, but we stopped getting extra food from the project." But in the north, which is better for livestock and farming, we see a woman who received Cash Plus BCC reporting that she had saved some of their money to buy land, suggesting a path to sustained economic security even after the program. For family dynamics, again, we see indications that in-laws can instigate conflict between couples in South Asia, so it's important to consider them. During the program, we see mixed changes. You see a quote, "My husband didn't beat me up anymore, but my mother-in-law and brother-in-law still did." And we still see mixed post-program reports. For women's empowerment, we see mixed changes during the program. There are some really interesting quotes reflecting increased financial autonomy, a feeling of agency from nutrition knowledge due to the BCC, but also some who say decision-making patterns haven't changed. And we see very limited post-program changes. And finally, for social and community support, we see during the program, this is very strong from the group BCC. A woman says, "When all the women sit together, we discuss many things. Everyone laughs and has a good time. I really like that." And then a man says about his wife going to BCC, "She learned a lot of things. She could also advise others," suggesting this role of the woman becoming community resources and experts was quite palpable. After the program, there's still a bit of this continued role of former BCC participants giving advice to the community on child nutrition and health, but women mostly mentioned they're too busy to continue direct contact with the other group members. Some also mentioned that community jealousy has actually reduced their access to other programs. So, to summarize, I know it's a complex picture. During TMRI, IPVs seem to reduce across all the arms and all the context due to the 4 pathways we've talked about. After TMRI, through 8 to 9 years post-program, the Cash Plus BCC consistently led to reduced IPV. Cash only had context-specific and time-specific sustained effects. There were less sustained effects from food or from any arm in the South. And the strongest pathway for TMRI causing sustained reductions in IPV was TMRI causing sustained improvements in economic security. The social and community support pathway does appear still strong for the group BCC participants soon after the program ends, but less so as time passed. So finally, in terms of implications for the future design of economic transfer programs at scale, first, we reiterate, we're finding again that economic transfers can be effective, scalable tools for IPV prevention. We see strong effects during the program. In terms of sustaining impacts, it does seem a promising pathway to sustain reduced IPV even after the program ends from these type of interventions is to develop designs that will sustain economic security for that specific context. Some specific program implications. We see that cash alone in this context, but not food, can sustain economic security, but it really depends on the context. Adding plus to the cash can actually help sustain economic security, and I didn't have time to get into how in this case, but happy to say more later. In short, we see that the plus component actually also improved women's psychosocial well-being and knowledge in a way that helped them build their livelihoods. We do see that the group-based plus in particular can sustain social support, at least soon after programming, and certainly norms play a role in whether these different pathways are sustained. Not every social protection implementer will be well placed to have the resources and expertise for scalable interventions to shift norms, but if they do, they may consider addressing norms that specifically limit these pathways that were activated but fade out. And a few other key points to be mindful of about community dynamics to ensure no one gets excluded from other programs, and family dynamics in South Asia to consider the important role of in-laws for IPV. So thank you very much, and we greatly appreciate our funders and study participants over 11 years for partnering with us on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Shalini. We'll now move to a school-based approach after looking at a Cash Plus approach. So I want to introduce our 2 final panelists, Hassan Malusi, who is a technical advisor to Raising Voices, and Jody Perlman, who is a senior research fellow at the London School of Tropical Health and Hygiene. Hassan and Jody, over to you. Interpreters are asking if you can keep the microphone close to the mouth. All right.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name once again is Hassan Lucy. I'll present with my colleague Jody. I would like to present our work on scaling a school-based intervention, the Good Schools Toolkit. And this is how our talk with you is going to flow. I'll talk a little bit about our work. I'll also talk to you about our thoughts around scale. And then I'll mention and talk about the main pathway we are pursuing for scale. Then I'll invite my colleague to talk about the research and then come back and wind it up. So about Raising Voices and the Good Schools program. Raising Voices is a feminist organization. We are based in Uganda. The bulk of our work is providing proven methodologies for preventing violence against women and children. I guess many of you in the room are quite familiar with SASA and the Good Schools Toolkit. For today, our focus will be on the Good Schools Toolkit. The Good Schools Toolkit is a set of ideas we provide to the teachers, the parents, and the learners in the schools to create good schools. Our tagline is good schools, but we mean creating violence-free schools. So we provide tools, we provide ideas for teachers and learners and their parents to discuss. Between 2012 and 2014, we had a big question whether our approach was working. And in collaboration with many colleagues, London School, Makerere University, we answered that question through an RCT. And it was a milestone for us to learn that the Good Schools Toolkit prevented or reduced violence by school staff to the students by at least 42%. Having hit that milestone, the big question now was, how do we take this to scale? How do we make everybody benefit, especially the learners in Uganda? So we started thinking about scale, and this is how we perceive scale. So for us, scale means asking yourself how involved a key stakeholder is in terms of pre-designing the intervention. This is one of the things we learned, that if key stakeholders are involved right from the pre-design stage, the scale intervention is likely to succeed. But you also have to ensure that you maintain high quality, and then you continually build the capacity of whomsoever will be involved in scaling up. It also requires you to hold sustained and collaborative process of mutual respect and understanding that everyone has something to bring on the table. So if you're working with the learners, make sure to get their ideas, the teachers and the parents alike. Now with this model, we reached about 1,000 schools, and the big question you might be having is, 1,000 schools is such a huge number, but then how did we make it? So we tried out several other models. We began by implementing directly. That could only take us that far. We tried working with many partners, and that still continues, but still we were not answering our question. And in 2019, we thought about a more viable model, and this is the regional resource persons model. I want to talk to you about the regional resource persons. Who are they? So these are teachers. Many of them are still active. Others are tutors of colleges. Others are retired teachers, educationists, and social workers. The yardstick we use to get these on board is the passion, love for children, and being interested in contributing to the education sector. These are taken through a rigorous process of recruitment, and therefore we are sure that they align with the values and the principles of an intervention like this one. So, with the resource persons, we were able to hit a milestone of 1,000 schools. And this gave us another big question. Is this an effective model we can use now to set bigger milestones? And so we set a strategy to reach 1,000 schools, but we needed evidence. So we collaborated with many colleagues still in the room and many others to garner this evidence. It's at this moment that I want to invite my friend, Jody, to talk about the research. Jody?
Thank you, Hassan. Hi, everyone. I'm going to walk us through some of the key research findings from the research component of this project. So I'm just going to start with what we actually did. So this was a pre-post study. So we sampled a proportion of all 1,000 schools participating in the broader project. And we looked at the change in a few different outcomes before and after implementation. So all schools in this project received the toolkit delivered through this new RRP model. We know a major limitation of this is that we didn't have a control group. But the major strength is that we're evaluating this intervention in the real world rather than in the controlled setting of a randomized control trial. The outcomes we were interested in were outcomes that we know shifted in the original primary school trial. So these were attitudes towards violence against children among teachers, and also markers of school operating culture among teachers. So we know these improved in the original trial. In this study, we were firstly interested in looking at the overall trend in these outcomes before and after implementation. Because we didn't have a control, we had nothing to compare it to, but we were just interested in understanding that background trend happening in schools. Then our second question was whether exposure to the toolkit and how much exposure teachers got of the toolkit influenced this background trend. So we did surveys among teachers, sampling 98 schools. We also have a lot of routine implementation data and qualitative data, but I'm mainly going to present the quantitative results, and Hassan's going to speak to the qualitative briefly at the end. Just to give you an idea of who participated in the surveys, in the end, 95 schools agreed to participate. This was across all regions of Uganda. 62% were primary schools, most were government schools, and we had about 11 or 1,200 teachers at baseline and endline. Here I'm just showing you the scores for exposure. So we measured exposure to the toolkit at endline using a set of 13 questions that we had used in previous studies on the toolkit that measure teachers' participation in toolkit activities and kind of elements that they observe in their school. Higher scores represent a higher exposure to the toolkit, and we can see in this graph there's quite a distribution of scores with teachers at opposite different ends of the spectrum. And we were using this distribution to look at the change in outcomes and how this varied with teachers at different ends of that spectrum. So I'm going to present the next results by each outcome. So starting with school climate, which was our first outcome. So this was measured using 16 items at endline. And here, higher scores for school climate represent a higher perception, so a better outcome. Over time, we saw a slight trend towards an increase in teachers' perceptions of their school climate. Here, I've just highlighted the scores at baseline and endline, the mean score, and the coefficient, so the kind of adjusted change in score. We can see a slight increase, kind of borderline significant. But our next question was whether teachers' amount of exposure to the toolkit influenced this trend. I'm going to show these results in a graph, but I'm going to start with just an example graph of what we ideally want to see, as the graph isn't the easiest to interpret. So this graph is showing the change in the school climate score from baseline to endline as the exposure increases. Because higher scores for school climate represent a higher perception or a better score. As exposure increases, we want this school climate score to increase. So we want this arrow to go up. So what did we actually see? We saw this. So really, teachers' perceptions of school climate didn't really vary by school level exposure to the toolkit. It wasn't a significant p-value. We see the lines going up very slightly, but there's not that much change. Okay, moving on to our second outcome, which is acceptance of physical discipline among teachers. This was measured using 5 items, and here, higher scores represent a higher acceptance of physical discipline, so a worse outcome. And over time, we actually saw a trend towards an increase in teachers' acceptance. Here, again, I've highlighted the mean scores before and after, and the change. And over time, we see that teachers have become more accepting. This was unexpected. We've had a couple of thoughts about why this could be. The first is around COVID. So we did baseline just following COVID after a really long school closure in Uganda. And we think there might have been more awareness around physical discipline and its harms, as organizations like Raising Voices were doing a lot of work to promote positive discipline and the harms of physical discipline. So this awareness possibly waned over time. The second is around measurement. So we did baseline in term 1 of schools and endline in term 3. And in term 3, exams happen, schools are much more focused on academics, and we think teachers might have been more willing to use harsher methods of discipline. But we're still looking into this. Hassan can also speak to this more at the end, but that was the overall trend. But our next question was whether teachers' amount of exposure to the toolkit influenced this trend. Here I'm showing the example graph again with the change in acceptance of physical discipline against the exposure. Here, because higher scores for physical discipline represent a higher acceptance or a worse outcome, we want there to be a decrease in the score as exposure increases. What did we actually see? We saw this. So, in schools with higher levels of reported exposure, there was a smaller increase in teachers' acceptance of physical discipline. So we can see that as exposure increases, while most of the results were still above 0, which would represent no change, they're still above 0, so we still see that overall trend of an increase in acceptance. But higher exposure to the toolkit is mitigating this increase. And this was a significant p-value. Okay, I'm just going to finish with presenting a quick overview we've done of an analysis looking at exposure to the toolkit and use of physical discipline at endline. So I'm not presenting the change in score here. This is only at the end. So it's a cross-sectional analysis. But we've actually seen that teachers who reported higher exposure to the toolkit were less likely to report using physical violence in the past year. So we see here an odds ratio of 0.92. So for each unit increase in teachers' exposure to the toolkit on that scale of 1 to 13, the odds of reporting use of past year physical violence decreased by 8%. So if we think about that across the whole scale of exposure, that actually adds up to a fairly large reduction. And we saw this in both primary and secondary schools. Okay, I'm now going to hand back to Hassan, who's going to highlight some of the emerging qualitative insights.
Thank you so much. Just getting it up all, I think our research shows that the model is quite promising in terms of taking scale. So if we are thinking about taking our interventions to scale, we should think about working with people who are at the grassroots and who are closer to the intervention areas. And then I think from the study and the program, we see that collaboration and working with different people and sectors is quite key. And then we also want to see that for all our interventions, we need to step up the exposure, because the more repeated the exposure is, the more we are likely to see the impact. And I would like to end here by thanking our partners, AfriChild, London School of Tropical Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and others who have supported us along this journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to open up for questions. Let us take a round of 4 questions, and then we'll see how we're doing with time. There are microphones. Yes, I see a hand in the middle here. If you want to move to the microphone over here. I see a second one over here. And I want to make sure I'm looking at both sides of the room. Here's a third one. And I'm sorry if I missed a fourth one and a fourth one up here. If you either have a microphone in front of you or can come to one of the standing microphones over here to ask your question.
Okay, so should I come here?
Do you see the mic in the middle there in the aisle?
Can I start here? Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, I can't see if there's anyone else with the mic.
Okay. Yes, go for you first.
Sure. Thank you all so much. I wanted to, just thinking about that 11-year process of reviewing implementation on economic strengthening, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about ethics. So when we see that an intervention is effective, what is our obligation to then scale it up? And what would you want to do differently in that process to avoid some of those pitfalls of community jealousy?
Was that to any of the presenters specifically or to all?
I'm happy to hear from everyone. I was referencing directly Dr. Roy's presentation.
Okay, great. And I think we've got one over here.
Hi everyone, morning. Thank you so much. This was an incredible panel, really amazing. I have a question in general. None of the presentations or the policies or the models have I would say like a strong gender transformative component and we still see very positive results in different types of gender-based violence, especially intimate partner violence. So I guess my question is, do you think that adding to your models and to the potential policies a strong gender transformative component is needed? Should we prioritize to do that, or do you think will be enough to continue pushing for like social protection programs, policies that support improvement of education, etc., but not necessarily with this kind of gender transformative strategy? Thanks.
Thank you. In the middle?
Thank you. Hi everyone, this is Amanda from Brazil. First of all, thank you so much. This is so inspiring. I have been sending all the pictures for our team in Brazil. I wish everyone could be here. So I wonder, one challenge that we have been facing in Brazil, our organization helps governments to implement gender-based violence prevention across educational departments. And one of the biggest challenges that we face is to convince the government about the importance of prevention instead of responding. So that's something that we have been hearing a lot from different educational departments. They look for us because they don't know how to answer about sexual harassment within school or sexual abuse that is revealed at school. And when we bring the idea of prevention, they are like, actually, can you just give us the answer on how to respond to the cases? So that's my first question, and I would love to hear the team from Rwanda on how did you convince the government. And the second thing is about the anti-gender movement. So I don't know if your experience have faced that, but in Brazil, that's something that we have been very challenged about how to implement gender-based violence prevention policies in a country in which the anti-gender movement is super strong. We have been trying to do it through the strategy of violence prevention, but for example, with the federal government, we are doing a program in which we can't use the word gender because the Congress will stop it if we do so. So I'd love to hear how the experience in Rwanda and Uganda have been dealing with that. Thank you so much.
One more.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Nia Said. I work for IPPF, the International Planned Parenthood Federation. So I wanted to ask about maybe unintended outcomes of some of the specific interventions in relation to sexual and reproductive health in terms of women's reproductive agency, access to contraception, spacing when it comes to childbirth, or just delaying childbirth once married. Because I didn't see any of the interventions, be it the Cash Plus or other, be it school-based or parenting interventions that referred to this issue. But we also know that the evidence exists when it comes to, at least when it comes to contraception and access to contraception and reproductive choices, that also affects the outcomes on IPV. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll just sum up quickly the topics that I got with the questions and how I think
Sorry.
Yes?
Over here.
Yes, please. We've got to go kind of quickly here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
My question is for Richard. So part of your presentation in terms of educational policies and reforms, so I don't know if there is any conversation around in terms of the establishment of mechanism for reporting. Because as a survivor of that, if there is no safe or secure policies in place for survivors to report cases, and the investigations are done in a way that they protect the survivors, there will be a form of retaliation by the abusers or their families. So within your presentation, I didn't see anything in terms of establishment of mechanism for reporting. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
I need to let the presenters respond, given the time.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm a visual impaired person from Nigeria, and then of all the people that present, I've not heard anything concerning inclusion. So what efforts are you making to include persons with disabilities in your program? And what are the criteria for including persons with disability in your programs? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm turning now to the panelists. We've got a question about ethics and what we know kind of looking back 10 years, if there's any comments you'd have there. We had a question about, are the interventions gender transformative, and what do we think is missing there? There's a question about prevention versus response, how you've convinced governments to take prevention seriously. A question of whether you faced any anti-gender equality backlash. A question around unintended outcomes related to reproductive health. And the final question around inclusion for individuals with disability. Given time, we've got 5-ish minutes, so maybe I would ask each person to take one of those themes you'd like to comment on, and then we'll pass it down this way. So start, Jody or Hassan, if you'd like to.
Hello. Okay, thank you so much. I want to take the question around convincing gender transformative component, whether it's needed in our interventions. Yes, the answer is yes, and I think any strong intervention must prioritize this because violence manifests in different aspects, and it's stronger in terms of gender and gender aspects. So our intervention, the Good Schools Toolkit, actually has this, and it's one of those enhancements when it even comes to secondary schools. It goes on changing as you progress through the intervention. I'll allow colleagues to respond to the rest.
All right, thank you. Shalini.
Sorry, is this? Sorry, I'll speak to the ethics question. Thank you for that great question. So I didn't have time to say, but this study actually informed a program at scale called the Mother and Child Benefit Program in Bangladesh, which is Cash plus BCC, for women through pregnancy to the child being of 5 years of age. So the program has been in a form scaled up. It hasn't been the cash values and so on are not exactly identical, but the findings have led to scale up. In terms of the community jealousy, though, I think it is not kind of formal exclusion, but it's sort of this notion that, well, they've already had their turn. You know, when there's kind of selection at the community level of identifying who are the vulnerable households, kind of a mention that, like, well, these people have already had their turn. So I think what needs to really happen at the community level is just sensitization on the fact that these programs are being targeted, and it's not about having the turn, but that everybody's in this together, and let's try to bring more people in rather than keep some people out.
Thank you. Fidel, Kate?
Yes, how do we convince the government? First of all, we need to be aligned to government policies. Second, we need to be flexible with the government, but also to show them evidence that it works and involve them into our planning. Thank you. So for the anti-gender movement, in Rwanda we don't have anti-gender movement, so we are part of women's rights movement, and as you know, Rwanda is a gender champion country, so we are lucky to be in a good environment where there is a high political will, and we have worked with a women's rights organization working on disability to make sure that within our group education, we also include people with disabilities. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just, can you hear? Add on to that, just to clarify that, Banda Bereho is also a gender transformative program, so it is very much challenging harmful gender norms and power dynamics between men and women. We didn't have enough time to really go into the program, but it also has a strong component of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we have seen that the program contributes to short-term improvements in the uptake of use of contraception, to greater, more equitable decision-making around family planning and child spacing. And we also shared at the last SVRI that the program has had both short and long-term impacts on reducing reproductive coercion in relationships. So I think there's a lot to be said around that. And just to add on to what Fidel said, we've seen that disability inclusion is a gap, and so that is where we have been partnering with a women's rights organization of women living with disabilities to see how we can integrate training on disability inclusion within the training of community health workers, as well as pilot and test some reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities to make sure the program reaches women who are at higher risk of violence, but also parents of children with disabilities who might face greater challenge and conflict in their relationships.
Thanks. Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I'd like to respond to the question about accountability mechanisms within schools. So when I was talking about education policy, I gave examples of policies that expand access. But the question raised a really important point, access to what kind of services and what kind of environment. And I think what you're suggesting, which is the need for either something like the Good Schools Toolkit, like we heard presented, or just a system of a survivor-centered system of accountability integrated into the school system. That's another type of policy that we could evaluate to see whether and how that can support lower rates of violence. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to congratulate all the presenters. I heard the importance of time and the slow and steadiness required to do it, the importance of the top-down plus bottom-up, the iteration that you did with listening to communities, the limitations as well as the promises of it, the challenges of evaluation, the ethics of it, and the age-old challenge of prevention versus response. I want to thank all of you for the thoughtfulness and your teams that we don't see them all here, but we know that there was 10 plus years at least of the work on this, of lots of individuals doing the work. So we want to acknowledge that as well. And thanks to the SVRI organizers for including this topic. If you'll join me in giving a round of applause to the Thanks, everyone.